In the last episode, Tokugawa Ieyasu and Toyotomi Hideyori finally cut ties after years of souring relations, with Hideyori having amassed a powerful army of his own made up of loyalists to his family and those scorned by the Tokugawa regime. Ieyasu was given all the justification he needed to march west and put down the rising threat in Osaka. The siege would begin in the winter of 1614, yet would continue on into early 1615, as Ieyasu was surprisingly held back by the determined Osaka defenders, who managed to beat back every attempt by the Tokugawa to assault the walls. This would in the end result in Ieyasu taking drastic measures, using cannons to rain destruction down upon the great citadel, an action which would ultimately lead to a peace agreement that would see Tokugawa soldiers dismantling much of Osaka's fortifications. However, the struggle is not over yet, as now hostilities are set to continue, and the two sides are to meet once again in the stunning conclusion to Japan's warring age. It had only been several months since the end of what would be remembered as the Winter Siege of Osaka, where brave defenders had stood valiantly against the tide of the Tokugawa shogunate, who sought to destroy Toyotomi Hideyori and the power he had amassed. And although their defiance had been legendary, it was the devastation caused by the cannons possessed by the former shogun, Tokugawa Ieyasu, that would truly bring the conflict to an end. This peace agreement had left a bad taste in the mouths of Osaka defenders such as Sanada Yukimura, Goto Mototsugu, and others who had rallied for hostilities to continue, never wishing to give in to the untrustworthy offers extended by Ieyasu. But they were ultimately unable to sway Toyotomi Hideyori himself, who was not only under the influence of the prominent Osaka commander Ono Harunaga, yet more importantly, his own mother Yorodono, who had become rather rattled by the effects of the siege and the destruction she had personally witnessed. In the aftermath, as we saw, those who were pro-war may have been right all along, as Tokugawa forces had immediately began dismantling the Osaka defenses as soon as the peace negotiations had concluded, something which had not been part of the agreement. This had resulted in the filling in of the moat and the toppling of walls and other structures like that of the Sanada Maru, which had so famously held against fierce assaults. Osaka Castle was no longer a defensible position. Ieyasu had made sure of that. What Ieyasu had likely hoped for was that without a proper place to hold up, Hideyori would not be motivated to ever challenge the authority of the shogunate again. However, even without a proper castle to guard him, he still had the powerful support of many. Toyotomi loyalists and ronin who had previously pledged themselves to Hideyori and had since been spared following the peace negotiations as a show of great generosity, began to return to Osaka as the dust from the siege began to settle, and the Tokugawa armies had cleared out. To this end, Hideyori was bolstered by the continued support of an ever-growing army once again. Though it would never reach the number he once had prior to the Winter Siege, it was still a mighty force that gave him the courage to once again begin plotting. Soon, work was being done to dig out the moat which had just been filled in, and perhaps even to see to the repair of other parts of the walls that had been demolished. It was quite clear that Hideyori was going to soon resume his challenging of the shogunate. Word of these updates in Osaka quickly began to spread across the land and to the ears of Ieyasu. However, he must have been anticipating the possibility of this. In fact, it is understandable that Ieyasu would have been largely joyous that he had another opportunity to head west once again, this time to firmly finish off the Toyotomi, being that it would be much easier a feat to accomplish without the defenses of Osaka to hold him back. By early May of 1615, Ieyasu began moving back west. However, he did not do so in a fashion that indicated any military action was necessarily taking place. Instead, he did so under the pretense that he would be attending the wedding of his son Tokugawa Yoshinao at Nagoya Castle. This was all while his other son, the current shogun Tokugawa Hidetada, began issuing orders for all loyal daimyo to amass their forces at Fushimi. By the middle of May, the Tokugawa army and their allies were in full mobilization and were forming up to pounce on the Toyotomi once more. Back in Osaka, despite efforts to rebuild the defenses, it was quite clear that doing so would be an inefficient strategy. Not only did significant fortifications fail to save them from artillery fire during the winter siege, but now with even less to defend them, it was a hopeless endeavor. If we remember back to the previous episode, an offensive strategy had originally been proposed by more militant members of the Osaka defenders, significant figures such as Sanada Yukimura and Goto Mototsugu, who had argued in vain that the best course of action was to be proactive and set out from Osaka to seize key locations, before Ieyasu had enough time to establish his siege. At the time, these suggestions had been shot down in favor of simply hunkering themselves within the castle, but now it was clear they had absolutely no other choice. However, the careful and cautious preparations made by the shogunate ensured that any attempt by the Osaka army to press out would be ill-fated. In late May, an attempt was made by Ono Harufusa, the brother of Ono Harunaga, along with Goto Mototsugu, who attempted to march east over the Ikoma Mountains to block off the Nara Road. Unfortunately, they would be met with stiff resistance when trying to siege down Koriyama Castle, which was held by the Tsutsui. This led Harufusa to instead just burn and ravage the area surrounding the castle before pulling back. Upon his return route to Osaka, he would continue his path of destruction, burning several more villages along the way. And although this may seem like a hostile and unprovoked action, it may have served as a tactic of scorched earth to harm any advance by the Tokugawa. Following this, Harufusa would set out again, this time heading south, where he intended on causing more damage. This would include the complete destruction of the significant port of Sakai. Yet his main aim appears to have been that of Wakayama Castle, where the Tokugawa-loyal Asano Nagaakira was preparing to march out to join up with the rest of the shogunal forces. Harufusa would clash with Nagaakira at the Battle of Kashi. Yet, at a severe disadvantage, the Asano would seize victory and force Harufusa to flee back to Osaka with his remaining men. Tragically, Ban Naotsugu, who had famously led the successful surprise attack across the Honmachi Bridge during the winter siege, would be slain in combat. These early probes by the Osaka army had proven to be somewhat of a failure, and by early June, unhindered, the shogunate forces were now converging. Although they had not fully formed up yet, and an opportunity presented itself to cut off, and at the very least hold back, a significant portion of the shogunate forces. This was a grouping that included such names as the Date, Honda, Matsudaira, and others, who were making their way through the Ikoma Mountains and into the plain around Osaka. It was here that the Osaka army would attempt to catch them off guard before they could make any further progress and link up with the rest of the shogunate army. In early June they would strike out, yet sadly, dense fog would completely ruin the plans of the Osaka defenders. Goto Mototsugu, who was at the head of a vanguard detachment of 2,800 men, was the first to arrive at Domyoji, a significant location that is home to the massive tombs of Kofun-era emperors. All alone, Mototsugu was determined to make a stand at the higher position of Mount Komatsu, where he would attempt to stall the shogunate forces, giving his allies enough time to arrive. Yet, as long as he waited, the rest of the Osaka army was still delayed in the fog. To this end, the shogunate began to make their way onto the field. Mototsugu valiantly led his men to attack a contingent of shogunate forces, driving them back. The Battle of Domyoji had begun. Intense fighting erupted all throughout the wooded hills as shogunal forces attempted to dislodge Mototsugu from his defensible position. Wave after wave of Date and Matsudaira forces were continuously repelled, yet Mototsugu's own numbers were beginning to run thin, with no sight of the Osaka army. Eventually, in a last defiant stand, Mototsugu charged out with the remaining men he had. It was here he would be wounded by gunfire, which then caused him to pull back where he would commit seppuku. Fate would have it, though, that around the same time, the fog would begin to lift, revealing that the rest of the Osaka army had reached the vicinity of the Great Tombs. They were too late, yet Sanada Yukimura, who was at the head of the army, was briefly determined to still make a stand. Shogunate forces were now rushing across the Ishikawa River to clash with the Osaka defenders, and quickly we see that Date troops would be some of the first to begin a heated engagement with Sanada Yukimura's division. Battle rang out across the Valley of the Dead Emperors as the Osaka army held firm, and Yukimura's division began repelling the Date assault. Yet, this was not the only flashpoint of the day, as two other battles would occur at the villages of Yao and Wakai. At Yao, Chosokabe Morichika would attempt to halt the advance of Toro Takatora, and although he would be unsuccessful, the outcome would still be disastrous for Takatora himself, as both of his sons would be slain during the action. At Wakai, Kimura Shigenari, Naito Sadatori, and Yamaguchi Hirosada clashed with Ii Naotaka. A vicious assault by the E-Red Devils would rip through the lines of the Osaka defenders and claim the life of Shigenari as the rest of the Osaka forces began to scatter. With news of the defeat at Yao and Wakai, along with the losses they had already suffered at Domyoji, a call for a general retreat back to Osaka was issued. Yukimura's division would act as the rearguard as the Osaka defenders began to withdraw in mass, allowing the shogunate a steady advance. Still, the shogunate forces had been heavily exhausted by the fierce resistance they had encountered throughout the day, and were not able to give a proper chase. However, Tokugawa Ieyasu's sixth son, Tadateru, was in command of a still largely fresh detachment, and thus was ordered to pursue Yukimura. It having just arrived from a long march, he would end up declining. This disobedience would allow the Osaka army to make a full and successful withdrawal, something that would later get Tadateru exiled. News of the victories at Domyoji, Yao, and Wakai would have overjoyed Ieyasu, giving him confidence that his measures here in the summer of 1615 would be met with greater success than the actions he had taken in the winter. With the Osaka army in full retreat, and with the castle in no shape to defend, victory was almost certainly assured. With the way clear, Ieyasu's plan was somewhat similar to what he had done before, albeit now with vastly different circumstances. With shogunate armies flooding in from the east, Ieyasu's goal was once again to establish himself upon Chaosuyama and strangle Osaka from all sides. Yet that goal would never be realized, as his plans were to quickly fall apart. Sanada Yukimura, now one of the last of the great Osaka generals, had pretty much assumed de facto leadership of the remaining Osaka army. Upon making his way into the castle, he met with Toyotomi Hideyori in their now considerably smaller war council. With all other hope having been lost, a desperate final plan was concocted. The last chance to stop Ieyasu would be to once again strike out at the shogunate army before they had a chance to establish themselves. The Osaka forces had been whittled down to now just a third of the size that the Tokugawa possessed, as rough estimates suggest that the remaining Osaka defenders sat at just around 50,000, while the shogunate may have had upwards of 150,000. Yet, if the shogunate could be spread out enough, an opening may present itself for a determined center group to charge Ieyasu's actual position, a daring move that could possibly end the battle with the removal of Ieyasu's head. To top it all off, it was planned that as a last attempt to inspire the troops and carry his forces to victory, Hideyori himself was to ride out of the castle bearing his father's armor and standard, a symbolic move to rally his brave loyalists onward. Ieyasu himself must have never expected that the remaining Osaka defenders would have ever attempted something so bold, which must have come as a complete shock to him when he learned that the very position of Chaosuyama that he was planning to establish himself at was now instead occupied by Sanada Yukimura and the majority of the Osaka army. It was clear that they were not about to go quietly into another siege, but rather give their all in a valiant last stand. This great and historic clash here upon the battlefield of Tennoji was about to begin. Upon Chosuyama sat the bitter and determined remains of the Osaka army, a host of vengeful warriors who would stop at nothing to grind the shogunate to a bloody pulp. And although they waited upon Yukimura's orders to engage, nerves and adrenaline would overtake many of them as shots began to ring out and Osaka soldiers began to engage with shogunal forces arriving from the east. As sporadic skirmishes began to commence all across the field, Yukimura himself continued to hold his own detachment firm. Releasing at devastating momentum, Osaka forces crashed through the Tokugawa vanguard, sending them fleeing into the Matsudaira body that was emerging from the rear. Yet they too came under heavy assault as Yukimura finally let loose and sent his men smashing into their flank. The shogunal army was not prepared for this show of force, as divisions were being either halted in their tracks or being steadily driven back. Yet this effort from the Osaka forces could not last forever, and Ieyasu knew this. But what must have caused sheer panic to overtake him was when he was notified of an incident of friendly fire occurring along the left flank. It was here some stories indicate that there was a massive incident of two Tokugawa detachments misidentifying each other as enemies and engaging. Now, not only were Ieyasu's forces being driven back by Yukimura, but his own men were also chaotically fighting themselves. This had the potential to ruin everything, as with the shogunate army already struggling, they may begin to waver. Ever hands-on, Ieyasu is said to have immediately set out on his own with just a small personal guard to fix the situation. Yukimura, on the other hand, was beginning to see his momentum give out, as Osaka forces were starting to stall, given their smaller numbers. Quickly, he ordered his son Daisuke to rush back to the castle to get Hideyori to sally out now. With his appearance, the Toyotomi loyalists might be reinvigorated to successfully drive the Tokugawa from the field. It was no sooner that Ieyasu had miraculously managed to calm his divisions that were engaging one another, successfully getting a grip on the situation. He must have recognized that now the Osaka army was starting to slow, and that his own forces should begin to push. However, it was at this point that it is said Ieyasu was still out on his own, dashing across the field with only a small detachment of his guard, and it would be here he would come into the sight of Yukimura. Believing this to be the best chance he would have at slaying Ieyasu, Yukimura and a small detachment of his own forces burst out to ride him down. A frantic pursuit began as Yukimura charged recklessly towards the former shogun. One by one his guards would be cut down until all alone Yukimura sprang within inches of Ieyasu himself. Terror must have engulfed Ieyasu to have come so far just to be slain here. Many stories of this encounter have emerged over the years, with some saying Yukimura managed to wound Ieyasu, and others even going so far to say that he actually did kill him. In reality, Yukimura came just shy of his goal, being held back by Ieyasu's defenders. Wounded and exhausted, he slumped down and is said to have removed his helmet, welcoming his long-awaited death. Sanada Yukimura would be slain, yet he would forever be remembered as one of the greatest and most heroic samurai warriors to have ever lived. The Osaka forces were soon enough being driven back after pushing all that they could. With this, the Tokugawa began to slowly force the Osaka army back towards the castle. Yet fighting was incredibly fierce, as the defenders would make the shogunate's army pay dearly for every step they took. Yet with flanking maneuvers that had succeeded in striking at Osaka from the rear, the situation was turning grim. It was at this time that Hideyori emerged, sadly too late. Sallying out from the castle, he barely made it near any of the action before the roar of battle and danger upon his life caused him to return. All was now well and truly lost for the Toyotomi. A fire had also now somehow broken out within the castle itself, adding a suitable backdrop to this tragic course of events. Many of the remaining Osaka commanders who had not already fallen began to defiantly take their own lives. In fact, one of the only prominent Osaka generals who did not manage to commit seppuku was that of Chosokabe Morichika, who was later captured and executed. The mass suicides eventually extended up to Hideyori himself, who along with his mother and even Ono Harunaga all killed themselves as the flames took the castle. So ended the final threat to the Tokugawa shogunate. Leaderless and in a frenzy to escape Ieyasu's incoming forces, surviving soldiers from Osaka began to flee. It was here a mass looting event would commence, as soldiers, likely from both sides, began to ravage the surrounding town. This was to be one of the worst instances of mass destruction, pillaging, and rape throughout the entire Sengoku period. But in the end it is often overlooked, because victory was now won by Ieyasu as his forces poured in from all sides. Throughout the burnt-out husk of Osaka Castle, many of the bodies of its brave defenders were found, and thousands of heads were claimed. Yet one would remain lost forever. Ieyasu would never get the satisfaction of seeing Hideyori's own head, for it would never be found and continue to haunt him for the short remainder of his life. This has caused all sorts of stories to emerge that Hideyori may have potentially escaped. Yet in all actuality, his body or head was either thoroughly hidden or perhaps even charred beyond recognition. One horrific detail, however, that would have soothed some of Ieyasu's worries was that Hideyori's young 7-year-old son would not escape the violence and would be captured by Tokugawa forces and later be put to death. As the fires ceased and terrifying displays of slaughter and pillaging came to a close, an unsettling calm must have crept over the area, as a thick fog of death would have hung in the air for the final time. With this, the last great battle of the Sengoku Jidai had been fought. Japan's Warring States era was now well and truly at its end, as the Edo period was to resume into its long days of peace. The heads of those who had defied Ieyasu would be aligned from Osaka to Fushimi in a grand display that the shogunate had won and that their will was to remain unquestionable. There was no one left to oppose him or his family. This man who had been born into the age of war and had so shrewdly maneuvered his way through so many obstacles had finally brought a lasting close to the age. But we will examine Ieyasu and his last days more in the next episode, in the closing to this series on the Sengoku Jidai. Yet for now, what can we learn from this episode? Following the end of the winter siege of Osaka, tensions had immediately resumed between Tokugawa Ieyasu and Toyotomi Hideyori in the spring of 1615. This would all culminate in the resuming of conflict between these two factions in the summer of that year. With the defenses of Osaka Castle having been largely dismantled, the Toyotomi loyalists would be left with no other choice than to strike out at the shogunate forces before they had a chance to begin a formal siege. This would result in significant clashes like that at Domyoji, and in particular the final great battle of the entire period at Tennoji. In the end, sadly, with the heroic death of Sanada Yukimura and the overwhelming of the Osaka army, the castle would fall and Hideyori would commit seppuku. Ieyasu had realized his final ultimate victory and had brought the warring Sengoku age to its fitting conclusion. In the next and final episode of the Sengoku Jidai series, we return to Tokugawa Ieyasu in his final days, as we discuss the great impact he had and the state in which he would leave Japan, moving further into the Edo period. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell if you enjoyed this video and found it to be most informative.